The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, the final part of our series on managing the different risks involved in international trade. This part will be covering corruption risk in emerging markets. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I'm the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Exports and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for traders, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, so please do ask questions at any point during this webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We've got two fantastic speakers today in Brook Horowitz, Managing Director of Culture of Business and Director of Special Projects at the IOE, and Cuneyt, Managing Director of Sius Consulting. To introduce yourselves in more detail, over to you, Brook.
Thank you very much, Will, and it's great to be back at the Open to Export webinar. Thank you very much for inviting us again. First of all, I'd like to introduce Cuneyt, Director of Sius Consulting. Cuneyt used to work for EY in Turkey in the fraud investigation and dispute services, and he was responsible in his last role there for forensic data. Since then, he's been advising on finance for finance-related risks for a UK public company, looking at Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, United Arab Emirates, India, China, all the places where there isn't any corruption at all. And myself, Brook Horowitz, I'm Managing Director of Culture of Business. That's my consultancy arm. I also run an NGO called IBLF Global, and we promote responsible business practices in emerging and developing markets. And I work very closely with companies, multinationals and local companies in various what we could call difficult markets, same ones that Cuneyt's been working in, to try and get business and government and international business to work together to reduce corruption. Right at the moment, I've got projects in Vietnam and in Kyrgyzstan, one of the Central Asia republics, former Soviet Republic, and I'm doing a project, interestingly, for the Department for International Development and the Department of International Trade to add corruption risk information to the great.gov.uk website, which has a very useful export journey, but right at the moment doesn't deal with corruption risk. So that's what we do. Now, if I could ask you to go to the next slide. Why has corruption become such a problem and such a big risk for companies? Well, first of all, the markets we're looking at are inherently risky. Now, this is particularly important since the UK, no doubt, will be moving out of the EU and exporters in this country have been asked by our government and asking themselves, how can we continue to grow and outside of the EU? And regrettably, most of the countries that are outside of the EU are high corruption risk. They may be poorly regulated, they may have weak rule of law, they may have undemocratic governments, they may have very weak press or civil society, many reasons for why they have a high degree of corruption. There are other things where there are different business traditions. For example, when I did some work in China, one of my counterparts said, well, we've been doing corruption for as long as you've been doing business, but actually they don't really consider taking people out for a meal or giving mooncakes with some yuans inside them as corrupt. This is just the way that business is done, and I think we need to be very, very culturally sensitive about these differences. There are also very good economic reasons why corruption is accounts for such an important part of doing business in these countries. And one of them is simply the differentials between rich and poor. And civil servants are not paid a lot. They're just above the breadline in some countries, but they have the power over products coming into the country or contracts being awarded of millions of dollars. It is too much of a temptation not to engage in some form of bribe solicitation. There's lots of red tape in many of these countries. Many of the former communist countries have kept their tradition of central administration. Red tape inevitably leads to more corruption. So in many countries of the world where British exporters are now focused, there is a pervading culture of corruption. Next slide, please. Could we have the next slide, please? Oh, maybe we've got it, sorry. Yes, the next point is that on the regulatory side, there's a lot of new legislation that's appeared over the years. The original anti-corruption legislation that really started biting just in the last 8 to 10 years or so comes from the United States. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. We may refer to that again. British Bribery Act, we're going to go into more detail in a few seconds, is relatively new. Came into force in 2011. Enforcement really only in the last 5 or so years. But also each country has their own anti-corruption legislation. You may think that highly corrupt countries don't have any anti-corruption legislation. Well, you'd be wrong, because most countries of the world have signed up to the Convention Against Corruption of the United Nations, which is the dominant international treaty that covers anti-corruption. But there's a big difference between signing a treaty and actual enforcement. Generally speaking, though, for UK companies, you've got to be aware that there's stronger enforcement, there's more international cooperation. Something like the FIFA trials for corruption would never have gone ahead if there hadn't been excellent cooperation between the United States and Switzerland. These things are relatively new phenomena. Other areas that you need to be aware of are the rapid development of financial technology, fintech, and data analytics, which can really discover all sorts of fraudulent activity, bribery, unusual financial flows at the click of a mouse. And also new whistleblowing legislation has also exposed a lot of wrongdoing. Next slide, please. Now, UK Bribery Act 2010 came into force 2011. It's really focusing on the failure of companies to prevent bribery. So your fundamental position is that you have to have in place all the kind of areas that of management that can show that you have done your best to prevent bribery, you are aware of it, and if you can't prove that, then you are exposed to prosecution and some pretty hefty fines and penalties and possibly prison. So I don't want to go too much into the details of the law, because what we're going to try and achieve, Cuneyt and myself today, is to share with you a flavor of actually working in the markets and what you can do about various situations. But if you're not aware of the UK Bribery Act, you do need to go through it, and on the next slide you'll have some links to click which will send you to the British government guidance. The Bribery Act is a little bit different from similar legislation in the United States, like the FCPA, in that it focuses not just on foreign government or bribing foreign officials, it's also company-to-company bribery. It's very clear about distributors and agents. So it's not just your own employees. If one of your employees gives a bribe, then that is one thing, but actually your representatives, such as a distributor or an agent, are equally prosecutable, and you are prosecutable if they give a bribe essentially on your company's behalf. So how do you regulate a third-party distributor and agent so that they behave according to the highest possible integrity conditions that your own company should be working to? It also covers facilitation payments, and this has been a very difficult one for British business because facilitation payments are just small amounts excuse me, small amounts of grease, if you want, to help the wheels go round, for customs officials and so on. Previously, I don't think anybody would have paid much attention to it, but actually it is in the law. There is a feeling that the Serious Fraud Office, which is the dominant government agency that prosecutes on the Bribery Act, would not worry too much about small companies. That's also not true. There's been a very notable case just last week where a small company essentially got done for bribery of around £10,000. It seems like a small amount in the big picture of things, but small or large, facilitation payments is not permitted under that. So this is quite a difficult thing for us to for British business to deal with. It's a game changer. Final point, extraterritorial application. That means that any bribery anywhere in the world that your representatives or employees get engaged in could be prosecutable under the Bribery Act. The Act asks companies to have adequate procedures, coming back to my earlier point. And the question that you should be asking yourself is, do you have adequate procedures? And I put them in inverted commas because it's a question. It's your judgment ultimately at this stage before getting into trouble. Do you have adequate procedures? If you don't, and you've made the wrong judgment about it, then you'll find out later. Some of this is in the guidance. Next slide, please. There you can, I'm not sure if you can actually click those. Sorry, I thought those were clickable, but they're probably not. Well, I think maybe, Will, we could allow people to, we could send out some kind of email after this and with those links. Is that possible?
Indeed. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So don't worry, everybody. We'll make sure that you get those links in case you need them. And as I say, do look out for the other legislation because it's all extraterritorial. US legislation, the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. France has joined the gang now, Sapin 2, and domestic legislations all over the world, notably China. Some big British companies know about that one. If you want to look up domestic legislation from any country of the world, you can go to this track, which is unodc.org. Cuneyt, is there any domestic legislation in Turkey against corruption?
Yes, indeed. First of all, thanks, Brook, for the kind introduction, and Institute of Export for having us. So, first of all, as you mentioned before, not many people know that the level of detail we can have when it comes to domestic legislations. Specifically, I can talk about the Turkey's case, where I know that Turkey already has a legislation, not as detailed as FCPA, but when it comes to the nature and details, I mean, in practice, it's quite similar to FCPA, which prevents Turkish companies and individuals to pay a bribe any foreign public official in any other country. So it's not widely known. And specifically in Turkey, there's a general tendency of not discussing cases of bribery and corruption in public space. However, from some time to time, there are intense government investigations targeting specific sectors such as pharmaceuticals, customs, and oil and gas. In those cases, biggest risk from companies' perspective is reputational risk, as they may face a high level of public criticism. And when it comes to the monetary effects of such investigations, we see that companies face a significant amount of penalties, but not only due to their corrupt practices, but due to tax-related issues, such as corporate tax or VAT penalties due to non-deductible nature of those illicit payments.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Next slide, please. So, yeah, to summarize what we've been talking about, and to go on to the next stage of our journey through the world of corruption or anti-corruption, the question is, why do companies pay bribes? And there's, as I said, there's a lot of red tape, so you want to bypass it. Sometimes you want to bypass the law, because in many countries, I mean, I'm actually speaking with you from Russia, and you know, there's so many there's so much petty legislation that where there's one law that pushes you in one direction and another law that completely contradicts it, and you know, in the end, it's a lot easier just to pay somebody to ignore it or turn a blind eye. I think for British business, especially for exporters, one of the biggest concerns must be around customs. And of course, it's well known everywhere in the world there's bribes being paid for customs. Maybe not bribes, maybe facilitating payments, although the Bribery Act doesn't distinguish too much between those. But just to speed the thing up, I mean, I can tell you of nightmares that I've had in this country, in Russia, in earlier times when I was working for an American multinational, and we were importing from the United States, and there were real nightmares. And you really had to find solutions, because doing nothing just made the costs increase in a way that was inconceivable. So I won't go into details about how I resolved the problem, but at the time, I have to say that the anti-corruption legislation was not as strong as it is now. But you know, we finally managed to find a solution without resorting to bribery, but it came pretty close. And then a lot of companies just offer bribes because they want a competitive advantage. And one of the points that becomes very difficult for British companies is if you're competing in Nigeria or in Kenya or wherever with the Chinese or with the French or the Germans or whoever, with the United States, I mean, with companies from those countries, and they are willing to give bribes, then, and you can't because of the Bribery Act and because we take our legislation seriously, then what do? How can you keep your competitive advantage? Or do you have to just say, well, I'm not going to go into that market? So there's some pretty big questions to ask yourself right at the beginning of your export journey and your choice of markets where you're going to be investing or trying to export to. Next slide, please. Well, I thought that it would be good to ask Cuneyt, who's actually from Turkey and from one of the quite difficult countries to give us a couple of examples of how companies, why companies give bribes and what they do about it and what are the consequences. Go ahead, Cuneyt.
Thank you, Brook. So today I would like to talk about a couple of hypothetical cases which summarize different types of risks companies may face in high-risk markets. Also, while talking about them, we'll also talk about potential actions management can take to mitigate the risks. And I do hope it's going to be not boring. So, in our first case, we are talking about customs officials who were obtaining lavish products with the explanation of testing. This resulted in both defective products and inventory shortages. And this case was discovered during company's independent year-end inventory count. So, first of all, what are the red flags? Increased costs related to inventory losses, unexplained missing items during inventory counts, and trading products which have a high value in the retail market and easy to sell over online platforms. So the issue in this case was local management of company turning a blind eye to malpractices of their customs broker and hiding such fact from their headquarters. After the issue was revealed, company headquarters obviously took some mitigating controls, such as changing its customs broker, and a new contract was drafted, which included both a right to audit and anti-bribery clauses. And internal audit functions started tracking samples provided to customs-related testing and its frequency for each quarter. And for this case, lessons learned is, first, bribe might be in many different forms, and it doesn't have to be in cash in hand form. Second thing is, company employees might have a motivation to turn a blind eye to malpractices. So if we move to the second case study, which is talking about a private bribe, because it's also covered under UK Bribery Act, unlike FCPA or other famous legislations. In this case, a whistleblower revealed that an employee of company established corrupt practices with one of their suppliers to embezzle company funds. And in this case, actually, we have lots of red flags, such as certain service costs, such as cleaning and security, were steadily increasing without a specific reason. Similar companies were joining the bidding process of the mentioned services, and almost always same suppliers were awarded for consecutive years. Only set of records related to the services rendered were held by suppliers. So in this case, company A had no data to cross-check the accuracy of invoices issued by the suppliers. And obviously, like as we see in many different cases, lavish lifestyle of employee who was overseeing mentioned services. This issue come to the attention following a whistleblower letter to the management of company A about corrupt relations between their suppliers and employees. Investigation on matter revealed that shell companies were being used during the bidding process to guarantee the success of corrupt suppliers. And furthermore, corrupt suppliers were not only increasing their unit costs, but also charging for services that were not even provided to company A. So during the investigation, various communications revealed between corrupt employees and suppliers about their secret deals, which we call kickback. And interestingly, one interesting fact, owner of one corrupt supplier was funding building of a summer house for an employee of company A. So after the investigation, company took some mitigative actions, such as they dismissed the employee under question and connected suppliers. A lawsuit was filed against both employee and suppliers. Company A implemented strict controls for monitoring services they received. And an audit was performed on supplier contracts to identify any discrepancy between agreed and actual costs of services. And going forward, companies started a mandatory employee rotation for certain roles. So lessons learned for this case is, first of all, benefit of having a well-communicated whistleblower hotline. It shouldn't only exist, but it should be communicated with relevant audience all the time. An importance of employee rotation for operations with a high corruption risk. And lastly, retaining complete and accurate data for the sake of ongoing or regular controls. So in our third case, I would like to talk about a customs broker again. And in this case, the customs broker was over-invoicing company by manipulating documentation and extracting excess amount to finance illicit payments and or embezzling funds for themselves. Red flags for our case were customs broker provided only photocopied documentation or just printouts as a supporting document instead of providing original documents. And customs broker had a quite protective approach, and he was easily offended by questions received by employees of the company. And the customs broker again was complaining about a high level of corruption in the country during their meetings with the company's management. So during an investigation, it was revealed that customs broker was charging amounts of illicit payments by using duplicate or fake documentation. And same practices were followed by management of customs broker to embezzle money. And company, unfortunately was not able to recover overcharged amounts due to malpractices followed until that time. So after the investigation, company used some mitigating controls, such as after various discussions, management decided to stop working with their customs broker at the time. And they included anti-bribery and independent audit clauses to their contract with their new customs broker. And for me, the lessons I learned from this case was businesses should not be easily convinced with invoiced amounts if there's a reasonable suspicion related with the amount or nature of expenses. And this is quite important because it's not easy to distinguish between an illicit payment and embezzlement, unfortunately. So
okay, thank you very much. That's well, I'm sure that people on this call may have some of their horror stories. Can I just get straight, Cuneyt, though, that none of these resulted in in the public authorities prosecuting these companies. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So the point was that the companies, either because of a whistleblower or because of their own analysis, they managed to find out what happened. They lost money in the procedure, but they didn't get into a situation where they were essentially taken to the cleaners by the public authorities.
Not that I know, at least.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's these are all positive examples of how companies were aware of the risks and were able to take action themselves rather than to have action taken for them by the Serious Fraud Office. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So you probably see some patterns now coming out of what we've discussed so far and some of the examples from Cuneyt. There's a huge amount of risk, and what what we call them in the business are red flags. Not everybody uses that term, but it's warning areas. It's things that you should be on the lookout for when you're working in these difficult markets. In fact, even in less difficult markets, because actually you need a proper system of governance that would keep control of these, a proper audit system, a compliance system. Now, I realize very well that many much smaller companies would not be able to have this, the big processes in place that global multinationals have. But certainly if you're an exporter, you need to have some of this in place, there's no doubt. And if you have not invested into risk management, then I think you are putting yourself seriously at risk in export markets. It's not a huge amount of funding that you have to put in, but it's things that will help you to be aware of these issues. So first of all, third-party agents and distributors. We've mentioned that under the Bribery Act, you are essentially responsible for their behavior. So you got to know who they are. I mean, there's, in the financial services industry, there are managers devoted to KYC, know your customer, and the distributor or an agent essentially a kind of customer for you, and you need to know who they are and who they're related to and how their behavior is, and it's just as important as any commercial information about the market that you may be getting. Excuse me, unusual buyer requests and requirements. So again, you've got to look for unusual patterns. I think that in some of the cases that Cuneyt was mentioning, there were some unusual requests, unusual behavior. That's a red flag. There are lots of red flags around marketing and sampling. For example, in the medical pharmaceutical business, samples can be given to such an extent that they almost become gifts. Gifts and entertainment themselves are an area of risk. Donations, political donations or charitable donations. Again, if those donations are being made separately, or the gifts and entertainment are being made separately from a particular deal, then there's less risk. But if it's somehow connected in time or in size to winning a project, then you're in a danger area. There are things about your employees abroad, for example, or even in the UK perhaps, of having too close relations between them and suppliers. What is that relationship? Are they family? Are they very close friends? Is there some other financial relationship between them that would certainly not stand up in court? What about politically exposed persons? Again, if you're dealing with politically exposed persons, this is a great big thing in the financial services industry, and money coming in from politically exposed persons essentially gets stopped. You might not get paid, by the way, if your clients are somehow connected with a PEP. Well, we've mentioned unusual buyer requests and requirements, unusual transactions, and I would say this last point, closed management culture, that's about your culture, because if you've got a very open culture and people are talking about these kind of risks and raising concerns and thinking about how do they do business with integrity, which is what you want people to do, then you've got less danger. But if your management culture is maybe very hierarchical, and there isn't such a discussion about the risks of corruption or fraud, then you're putting yourself at risk. And it may be that it's just nobody's giving a bribe or making some kind of terrible financial mistake on purpose, but you're getting into the area of ethical blindness. In other words, turning a blind eye to stuff which is right there. And with hindsight, you will find out about that. But by the time you found out about it, the public authorities have found out about it as well, because somebody has done a whistleblowing exercise and you're in big trouble. So I think that this thing about how you structure your relationships with the company to get a very open discussion about this issue is quite an important thing. Next slide, please. So, Cuneyt, how about telling us a little bit about how to avoid bribery? This is we got a proactive approach and a reactive approach.
Indeed. And before moving to this, I would like to have a small comment about the donations. And I believe companies should pay specific attention to the donations, because in some cases what we observed is that from the outside it looks like a normal donation, charitable donation, etc. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that actually the charity was owned by a relative of a public official or politically exposed person. So I highly advise companies to dig a little bit deeper and do their homework before making charitable donations in high-risk countries. And okay, if we move to do how to avoid bribery, so we classified it under 2 different sections. So first of all, you can do proactive things to prevent it, and the best thing would be training your employees. There are really great tools out there provided by different institutions online, and alternatively you can have your own offline training. Try to design something bespoke which is targeting your risks specifically. And when it comes to policies and procedures, you should clearly define roles and responsibilities of people. You may have a no cash payment policy, and in that case you shouldn't retain a cash register in the office. And you may say, no payment without written approval of the management. You may retain a gift registry, and similar to that, you may also have a donation registry. And as we mentioned previously, rotating employees, mandatory rotation is a really effective method for prevention. And if we move to the due diligence first, it's quite easy. It's a low-hanging fruit from my perspective. You can reference check your agents, or alternatively use a structured due diligence process, enabling you to benchmark your agents or perform horizontal analysis going forward. And you can ask your agents to take an online training which provides certification as a proof. And you may include audit and UK Bribery Act related clauses in your contract. And one other thing which I find pretty useful is when you are asked for bribe, you may ask any request in writing. So next slide, please. Okay, when we come to the reactive approach, so first of all, in almost every case, I would request supporting documentation for your costs and expenses. You may perform an internal audit on a periodical basis, or if you see specific risks, you can tailor your internal audit for that as well. And having an independent audit function is a good idea as well, because in ideal case, independent audit teams are more experienced in these cases when it comes to anti-corruption, especially. And you may explain potential consequences of a corrupt activity to your employees so that they are aware of what they're up to. And last two steps, you may check payment-related documentation. And what I mean is you should concentrate on recipient, explanation, date, document numbers, amounts, and currency, because in my experience, those are the information which is likely to be manipulated by corrupt suppliers. And you can also review your expense invoices, especially the ones related with expenses. And if I were you, I would concentrate on any unusual expense items with high or round values, any duplicate items, and ambiguous or no explanation expenses. So we have a question here. What do I do if I'm asked for a bribe? So I noted a kind of good practice you may follow, but obviously it won't be applicable for every case. But first of all, I think you should avoid being in a secluded place with the officer. As much as possible, you should be in the open, in the public, because such requests are hardly made in the hearing of other third parties. Second, you shouldn't put yourself in a position where you and the officer are whispering to one another. You should always speak up to the level where others can hear you easily. And in a case you face a request, you may ask questions like, okay, what is this payment for? I don't see it anywhere, which is written. I already paid for this amount for this service. Or you may refer to your consultants in the office saying, okay, our consultants already checked the expenses, they already paid for it. And if the other party is insistent about it, the payment, you can say, okay, I'm willing to pay, but in that case, you should be providing me an official government receipt so that I can reclaim it from my company. So probably, almost certainly, they won't be able to provide this, but if they still insist, you may say that, okay, you want to see their supervisor, if any. And in that case, supervisor may, finish the conversation, or he or she may also support the previous officer, or the officer, the initial one, can refuse to grant you access to his or her supervisor. In that case, you may say that, okay, you need to obtain permission from your manager in advance in the absence of a legal receipt. So these are the methods you may use in high-risk markets to prevent any getting involved in corrupt practices. So next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cuneyt. I think that the message from this is that you have to remove the personal element from the relationship, and that's difficult because normally in business in many of these countries it's actually the personal relationship that is all important. But when it goes to this kind of personal relationship, then what Cuneyt has been talking about is to actually start talking a bureaucratic language to them. Well, it's not within the policies of my company. I need a receipt. I need to discuss this with my manager. I'd like to discuss that with your manager at the next level up, the supervisor, and so on and so forth. So actually, in on the last slide, we'll give you a couple of indications of some useful resources. And one of the resources that Cuneyt and I worked on a few years ago was a toolkit, an anti-corruption toolkit for small and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, it was a toolkit for enterprises in different countries of the world, not specifically for UK companies, but actually looking it over now, it's just as relevant to UK companies. And one of the chapters we put in there was 30 ways of saying no, and that's what it is. I mean, you have to use your imagination to push that solicitation away from you. Even better than that is not even to get into the situation where you're asked for the bribe. And if it's so patently clear from your demeanor, the way you're talking, the way you're acting, that you are not even to be approached, that is by far the best way of doing it. And the experience of companies in these markets, British companies exporting or investing in these markets, is that once you start accepting the notion of giving a bribe or some kind of undercover activity, you will continue to go down there, and to get out of it is extremely difficult. So better not start, better not even get close to that situation if you possibly can. If you do get in there, next slide please, and if inadvertently you've given a bribe, or one of your employees has, or maybe one of your agents has, and I think this whole issue about risk around agents and distributors is completely unresolved, at least in my mind, and I think in the mind of the lawyers, because how you can control a third-party agent in the Democratic Republic of Congo or whatever is anybody's guess. But anyway, if it does happen and you discover it, well, that's a good thing, because you've got control over what you do next, and that's a very important situation. And a lot of the recommendations that Cuneyt was talking about when you're being proactive is to do with self-discovery. You may have a whistleblower, and again, I've talked about the management culture that you need in your company to make sure that whistleblowing works. It's not just a question of having a phone line and having the whistleblowing system set up. It's a question of the culture in the company that will make it clear to people that they should be doing that for the benefit of the company. Then the question is, what do you do with that information? Do you shut up about it and try and resolve it yourself, or do you report it to the public authorities, or as a kind of self-reporting? If you don't, and your whistleblower isn't heard properly, the whistleblower can go to the public authorities, and then that's where the difficulty begins, because you probably won't be able to prove that you've got adequate measures in place. You don't have a proper anti-corruption system, and even when the whistleblower came to see you, you didn't pay any attention. You just tried to bury it. It is very complicated. There's also issues around reporting in different countries, because we've pointed out the anti-corruption legislation differs from country to country. If you're in an international business, and this is a bribery situation, for example, in several different countries, then where do you report it? Get some legal advice. At that point, you need legal advice. Next slide. Well, we've come to the end of the formal part of our presentation, and we'll take some questions and answers now. I think we've got another 10-15 minutes left, but there's our details if any of you want to get in touch with us to talk about this in more detail, or if you need any advice or help in structuring compliance systems or audit systems. I'm more on the sort of legal side, Cuneyt's more on the accountancy and audit side. On the right, you can see some resources. There's that toolkit. We'll send you these details after the SME. This is the anti-corruption toolkit for small and medium-sized enterprises, which Cuneyt and I produced a few years ago for the B20, G20. There's Doing Business Without Bribery, put out by Transparency International. Very good not-for-profit TI, which focuses on this issue, and they've got some really good materials. The Institute of Export has some advice on the Bribery Act and on anti-corruption. And by the way, just to the last point, I'll be doing a full-day seminar in London on the 17th of October, so look out for that. I don't think it's been posted up on the site, but if any of you are interested in going into these questions in more depth, it'll be great to meet you in person. And then one more point is that I'm doing this project with the Department of International Trade and DFID. It's this site, great.gov.uk, which is essentially a guide for exporters. And my team is putting in new anti-corruption and anti-bribery advice within the export journey. So that's not up yet. It'll probably be another 2 or 3 months before that appears. Okay, so Will, over to you.
Many thanks, Brook and Cuneyt. Yeah, really great. Well, in your words, a journey through corruption, but it's definitely one of the under-discussed but really important areas of international trade. So, yeah, thank you both for speaking today. Yeah, as Brook's just said, we're going to now move on to a quick Q&A. So please do use the question kind of panel on the control panel to the right hand side of the screen if you want to ask any questions. We've not had loads coming through, but one we've had in is just around how far back can prosecutions take place? So kind of how retrospective can judgment be on kind of cases of corruption? Brook, do you want to speak to that?
I think I'm going to have to come back to you on that. When we write to you, I will answer that question. I haven't got a precise answer to that.
Right, thank you. And yeah, I'm obviously always happy to take questions offline where possible. One question I was wanting to ask actually is in connection to Russia, who you brought up at the start, and the Institute of Export had a really interesting survey today which showed that confidence of UK exporters looking at Russia as a market is really low. So out of kind of 1 to 10, only kind of about 10% were scoring 7 out of 10 in terms of their confidence selling into Russia. How much of a part does obviously the political kind of tensions play in this, but also how much of that is corruption, and what can be done to open up the Russian market, do you think, for more SMEs?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think, yes, Russia's gone up and down in people's estimation. And I do remember periods when it was just like this in the old Soviet Union. The last years of the old Soviet Union, there were these political tensions and business was really difficult. And Russia, the Soviet Union, kept on giving itself a really bad press, just like now. I think it's a combination of politics and also the conditions of doing business in Russia. But if you think about it, the political winds change direction all the time. I mean, it hasn't always been this bad. And there were periods when, I don't know, when Maggie Thatcher was being friendly with Gorbachev, and more recently as well, when Russia was the flavor of the day, but it was still very difficult for companies to do business. But I mean, everything that Cuneyt and I have spoken about today in this webinar applies, because you can still do business in Russia without paying a bribe. You can still maintain your personal integrity and your company's reputation doing business in Russia, but not engaging in the bunny business. It's quite possible, but these tips that we gave you at the end there about how to avoid corruption proactively and actively, those apply. They completely apply. You've got to know your customer, you've got to know the people you're dealing with, you've got to be ready to say no and to walk away from a deal. But in the end, I would also point out that not everybody in Russia or in many of these other countries are corrupt. You can always find people who want to do business the right way.
Absolutely, and the people point is that there's plenty of lovely Russians out there. That's always important to remember. One question we've had in from Sophie, and it's just asking if you could give any more examples of prosecution for violation of the UK Anti-Bribery Act, and particularly SME ones would be of interest. So do any examples which you can share come to mind?
Well, I should have been prepared for this question, and I mean, they're on the whole, they're bigger companies, and I think that there's some investigations going on. I don't want to mention the names of the companies, but they're big established UK companies. There is, as I said last week, there was a small company, and it did get prosecuted. The bribe was something like £10,000 or something. It was really quite small fry. I'll do a little note about that with a link to the story.
Many thanks, and yeah, obviously, as mentioned before, we'll be including all the links included in the session today. So please do keep your eyes peeled for that email, which will come through to all attendees and non-attendees today. And one final question we've had in, and it's someone who's got management responsibility for an overseas entity under the ownership of their Chinese parent. And they are asking, would this fall under UK or Chinese anti-bribery legislation? I don't know if it's a bit specific, but can you answer that now, or is that one for offline?
Just say that again, because I need to take it in. It's a UK entity that is under a Chinese parent.
Yeah. So
well, I think if it's a UK entity, it's under UK legislation, as far as you're concerned. Yes.
Cool, great, thank you. But yeah, we've run out of time now, really. So I'd just like to say one last thank you to Brook and Cuneyt for speaking today, and I hope everyone's found that useful. So yeah, thank you once again to Brook and Cuneyt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, so our graduation ceremony in London is later this month, and it's coming up really fast now. So this is a great opportunity for businesses and people in trade to meet some of the future stars of international trade and to network with senior figures and decision makers across the industry today, including the Secretary of State for International Trade, Dr. Liam Fox. You can go to export.org.uk/events to find sign-up details for that. And perhaps it could be you next year qualifying or gaining a qualification in trade, or someone from your business doing so. Our qualifications are designed to give individuals and businesses the skills needed to export successfully and compliantly. You can find out details about how qualifications can help your business go global and do it well on export.org.uk/qualifications. We've only got a couple of days left now for companies to enter the Spring Export Action Plan competition. The final is taking place in London at the UK Trade and Export Finance Conference on June 7th. And once again, the competition is a great opportunity for SMEs to win £3,000 towards their export plans. More info about that is on our website, and the deadline for entry is 5 p.m. on Friday. So yeah, do have a look at that and do so quickly. Our next webinar is on researching routes into overseas markets, and that's with BB Financial Services on May 9th. Following that, we will be looking at the opportunities and challenges in selling to Japan on May 16th. You can find sign-up details for all of our future webinars and also catch recordings of previous webinars on open2export.com/webinars. As always, please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions or for improvements or for future topics. Many thanks and have a lovely bank holiday, everyone. Goodbye.